I met up with Sarah Johnson, Michael Green, and Emily White early Saturday morning at the Trailhead parking lot. The Catskill Mountains near Phoenicia, New York, looked great, even at that hour, with the last bits of morning fog still clinging to the highest peaks. We were all hyped for our weekend camping trip. I had done my research, and Woodland Valley campsite was supposed to be perfect, secluded, rustic, just challenging enough for a real getaway. After a quick gear check, mostly Mike giving my packing a skeptical once-over, we started up the giant ledge trail. The trail began with a pretty steady incline, winding through thick woods. Sunlight filtered down in patches, making the leaves on the ground look almost gold in some spots. It felt good to be out there, away from, well, everything else. Emily was already making jokes, pointing out funny-shaped trees, and Sarah was taking pictures on her phone, trying to capture the morning light through the branches. Mike, true to form, was practically power walking, setting a pace that was a bit much, but I knew he just got excited in the outdoors. He was always the most eager one to get moving. About 30 minutes in, the trail got steeper, with more roots and loose rocks. That's when it started to get a little tougher than I had hoped. Sarah, who wasn't really a regular hiker like the rest of us, began to struggle a bit. She stumbled a few times on the uneven ground. Nothing serious, just a little loss of balance, but I could tell it was frustrating her. Every time it happened, she would mutter something under her breath, a mix of a sigh and a small groan. I tried to offer a hand once, but she just waved me off, saying she had it, even though her face was getting red from the effort. Mike, oblivious, kept pushing ahead, already a good 20 feet in front of us. Emily slowed down a bit to walk with Sarah, chatting with her, trying to keep her spirits up. I just sort of fell in between them, listening to their conversation. The path felt like it got steeper with every new bend. The trees grew taller, and the sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy above. After a couple of hours, we decided to stop for a quick water break. Sarah practically plopped down on a fallen log, taking deep breaths. She looked pretty tired, her face a little pale beneath the flush from the climb. "Man, this is more of a workout than I thought," she said, leaning her head back against a tree trunk. "It's giant ledge for a reason, Sarah," Emily said, taking a long drink from her water bottle. "The views are worth it at the top, trust me." Mike just grinned, unwrapping a granola bar. "Almost there, guys. We just gotta keep pushing." I knew he meant well, but almost there, from Mike usually meant we still had a solid hour of climbing left. He had a different sense of time when it came to hiking. We kept going after that, slowly making our way up. The air began to change, getting a little cooler as the afternoon wore on. The sounds of the woods also seemed to shift, growing a bit quieter, like the forest was holding its breath. The chirping birds and rustling leaves from earlier seemed to die down, replaced by a dull quiet. The trail kept throwing new challenges at us. We navigated narrow passes between huge rocks, climbed over thick, exposed roots, and crossed a small, gurgling stream by hopping on slippery stones. Sarah stumbled again near the stream, her foot slipping on a damp patch of dirt. She caught herself on a tree, saving herself from a full fall, but but she let out a frustrated gasp. "You okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She nodded, not looking at me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just stupid roots." I could tell she was getting worn down, and it wasn't just physical. There was a little tightness in her shoulders, a general tension in her posture that I hadn't noticed before. We pushed on, knowing we were running out of daylight. The light in the woods was getting dim, turning from a warm yellow to a hazy gray. The leaves overhead formed a deep, dark patchwork, blocking out what little light was left. Just as dusk truly started to settle in, we finally reached the campsite. It wasn't really a clearing, more like a slightly flatter area tucked between a few massive pines. There were a couple of old, fire-blackened stone rings, but that was pretty much it. Like the website said, rustic. Maybe a little too rustic, if I was being honest. The air here felt different too. It was still, almost heavy, and a lot colder than it had been on the trail, even before the sun set. We quickly got to setting up our tents. Mike and I got mine and his up, while Emily helped Sarah with hers, since she wasn't as familiar with pitching a tent as the rest of us. The last bit of light faded fast, and we were pretty much working by the glow of our phones. Once the tents were up, our next priority was getting a fire going. Mike was the resident expert on that, and he quickly gathered some fallen branches and leaves. Soon enough, a small campfire sputtered to life, casting flickering light and dancing shadows against the darkening woods. The flames cracked and popped, throwing off a bit of warmth, which was a relief. As the fire got going, I couldn't help but feel that chill Mike had noticed earlier. It wasn't just the cold air, it was something else, a subtle prickle on my skin. I rubbed my arms, pulling my jacket a little tighter. Mike, who was adding more wood to the fire, suddenly stopped. "You guys smell that?" he asked. His voice was lower than usual. I sniffed the air, trying to place it. "Smell what? Sort of acrid, like something burned, but not wood smoke." He waved a hand in the air. "It's faint, but it's there." Emily came over, holding her hands out to the fire. "I don't smell anything, just campfire, maybe a little pine." Sarah nodded, a little too quickly. "Yeah, definitely just pine." She looked a little too eager to dismiss it. I took a deep breath. And yeah, there was something barely there, a chemical type of smell, very faint, underneath the wood smoke. It didn't belong. It made the hairs on my arms stand up a little bit. I told myself it was probably just the damp leaves burning off, or maybe something weird coming from the soil. That's what I told myself. We were in the middle of nature, after all. Everything smells different out here. Emily, sensing the sudden shift in mood, pulled a deck of cards from her backpack. "Anyone up for some euchre? We need to lighten the mood a little, don't we?" We all agreed, grateful for the distraction. We sat around the campfire, the small circle of light our only refuge in the growing darkness. The flames cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and twisted into weird shapes against the trees enclosing us. The familiar snap of cards and the occasional laugh helped chase away some of the weird feelings that had started to settle in. We played a few hands, talking about nothing important, just enjoying the quiet company. Then, a twig snapped in the dense woods nearby. It was loud, too loud to be just a squirrel or a rabbit. It sounded like something heavier, something with more weight behind it. We all froze, our cards still in our hands. The laughter died, and the silence that followed was instant and heavy. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight. I already had my phone out, my thumb finding the flashlight icon. I pointed the beam into the trees, sweeping it back and forth through the darkness. The light cut through the gloom, showing only trunks and branches, shadows. Nothing moved. Nothing was there. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound casual, trying to convince myself more than anyone else. "Or maybe a bear." Mike didn't look convinced. "That sounded pretty close for a deer, James." "Yeah, well, it's the woods," I repeated, lowering the flashlight, though I kept it ready. "Animals make noise. Besides, it's gone now." Emily picked up her cards again, though her movements were slower now. "Let's finish this game." We tried to go back to playing cards, but the mood was gone. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl made us all jump a little. Sarah was especially quiet. She kept glancing over her shoulder into the darkness, her eyes wide. That little prickle of unease I had felt earlier seemed to stick to her now, a persistent, unwelcome presence. She fidgeted with the edge of her card, her brow creased. I could see she hadn't shaken it off, not like I had tried to. She kept looking out past the firelight, into the deep, dark woods that surrounded our camp. I told myself it was just her being uncomfortable in the wilderness. Lots of people felt like that, especially at night. I just didn't like the way she was staring, like she could see something I couldn't. I woke up the next morning feeling off, like I hadn't really slept. The air was colder than it should have been, and way too still. No birds chirping, no rustle of leaves, just a heavy, thick quiet. It was Mike who finally pulled me out of my tent. "James," he whispered, his voice sounding rough. "Sarah's gone." I pushed aside the tent flap, blinking against the muted gray light. The first thing I noticed was the empty space where Sarah's tent should have been neatly closed. Her tent flap was wide open, flapping a little in a non-existent breeze. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The cold was getting to me. He just pointed, his hand shaking a little. "Look," I looked. Her tent was empty, the sleeping bag still rolled out inside, undisturbed, like she had never even gotten into it. My mind couldn't quite put it together. Had she gone to the bathroom? But why would she leave her tent wide open? And why wouldn't she wake one of us? I started to feel a prickle of unease spread through me, the same feeling I had tried to ignore last night. "Sarah," Mike called out, his voice a little louder now, a desperate edge to it. He walked over to her tent, leaning down to look inside. "Sarah, where are you?" Emily's tent unzipped then, and she poked her head out, her face tired. "What's going on?" "Sarah's not here," I told her, my voice feeling flat. Emily's eyes went wide, and she scrambled out of her tent, her gaze going straight to Sarah's open flap. "What? No, she has to be." We started calling for her then, all three of us, our voices echoing in the unnatural silence of the woods. "Sarah, Sarah." We walked around the small campsite, checking behind trees, looking into the deeper shadows. It was a small clearing, though. There wasn't really anywhere to hide. Every time we called, the woods just swallowed the sound, giving us nothing back, but that deep, heavy quiet. I walked over to the campfire pit, the coals from last night's fire already cold and gray. My eyes scanned the ground, hoping to see something, anything. And that's when I saw it. Tucked right by one of the fire-blackened stones, almost hidden by a scattering of fallen leaves, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was roughly the size of my palm, shaped like a sparrow, with tiny, detailed wings and a little beak. I knew none of us had seen it before. It was Sarah's, Emily's, or Mike's, and it definitely wasn't mine. I reached down and picked it up. The wood felt surprisingly warm in my hand, a strange contrast to the cold air around us. I ran my thumb over the smooth, carved surface. It was pretty old, no doubt. But where had it come from? And why was it here, right next to our fire pit? Guys, look at this, I said, holding up the wooden bird. Mike and Emily came over, their faces pale. Mike took the bird from me, turning it over in his fingers. What is this? Did Sarah have this? No, Emily said, shaking her head. I've never seen her with anything like that, and I've definitely never seen it around camp. It was just sitting there by the fire pit, I added. A shiver went through me that had nothing to do with the cold. This didn't feel right. We went back to Sarah's tent. Mike went in first, pulling out her backpack. Her phone's still in here, he said, pulling it out. And her jacket, her everything. That just made it worse. Why would she leave without her phone, without her jacket, especially in this cold? It made no sense. Panic started to really set in now, a tight knot in my gut. Sarah wasn't just gone, she was gone without any of her stuff. What do we do? Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were already red-rimmed. Mike looked at me, a desperate confusion in his gaze. She wouldn't just wander off, not like this. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself too. Maybe she went back down the trail, to the car or something. It was a pretty weak theory. Sarah hated walking in the dark, and she was already struggling on the trail yesterday in daylight. The idea of her heading down alone, before sunup, with no gear, was pretty far-fetched. But what else did we have? It's the only thing that makes any sense, I said, even though it didn't really. We should go down the trail, retrace our steps, see if we can find her. The decision was quick. We packed up our minimal gear, leaving the tents set up as a marker, just in case she came back while we were gone. We left a note inside her tent, too, telling her we had gone down the trail. A crazy idea, but at least it was a plan. The descent down Giant Ledge Trail was even less fun than the climb up. The woods were still wrapped in that heavy, unsettling silence. We didn't talk much, just called out Sarah's name every few minutes, our voices flat and hoarse. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made us jump. It felt like the woods were watching us, silent and judging. It was a relief when we finally started moving. As we went, a thick fog began to roll in. It wasn't like the light morning fog I had seen yesterday from the parking lot. This was different. It came in fast, in thick, cold waves, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. The trees faded into indistinct shapes, and the trail itself became a blurry path under our feet. It felt like we were walking through a cloud, or maybe something worse. The fog made the air feel even colder, a damp chill that seeped into my bones. We passed the spot where where Sarah had stumbled yesterday, near the small, gurgling stream. I remembered her frustration, how she had caught herself on that tree. My eyes dropped to the ground, searching just out of habit. And that's when I saw it. A faint, shallow indentation in the mud, right next to a gnarled root. It looked suspiciously like a partial footprint. It was a little too large and a weird shape, not like any of our boots. I stared at it for a second, then looked away, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Just a trick of light in the fog. Or maybe an animal print I didn't recognize. I didn't want to think about what it could mean. We kept walking, the fog getting thicker with every step, making the woods feel even more isolated, even more unknown. We didn't linger at the campsite. The idea of Sarah being somewhere out there, hurt or lost, pushed us to move fast. There was no argument about what to do. We just started grabbing our stuff. My minimal gear went quickly into my pack. Mike and Emily were doing the same, their movements quick and jerky. We decided to leave our tents up, like a silent promise that we'd be back, or maybe as a beacon if Sarah somehow stumbled back to camp while we were gone. It felt like a flimsy hope, but it was all we had. I even scribbled a quick note, just a few words on a piece of paper, telling her we'd gone down the trail to look for her. I left it on her sleeping bag, a futile gesture, I knew, but I had to do something. As we packed up, the air felt heavier, pressing down on us. The fog that had started to roll in on our way down the trail had thickened into a dense, soupy mess. It clung to the trees, wrapped around the campsite, and blurred everything into a gray, featureless haze. It was like walking into a cloud, or maybe like the world had just decided to disappear around us. The silence was still there, too, that awful, suffocating quiet that made my ears ache. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the strained sound of our own breathing and the rustle of our jackets as we moved. "Ready?" Mike asked, his voice a low rumble, barely cutting through the thick air. He had his backpack slung over one shoulder, looking completely out of place in this quiet, damp world. I just nodded, slinging my own pack on. Emily gave a shaky little sigh. We started walking, trying to move with purpose, but the fog made every step feel uncertain. We shuffled out of the campsite, the faint outline of our tents fading almost immediately behind us. The path that had been merely tricky on the way up now felt like a test, every root and rock a potential trap. We moved slowly, cautiously, our eyes straining to see more than a few feet in front of us. The white, milky fog swallowed the light, making it feel like dusk, even though it was still morning. It was cold, too, a damp, penetrating chill that went right through my jacket and into my bones. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling ice. My teeth started to ache from it, a dull throb in my jaw. We called out Sarah's name over and over, our voices swallowed up by the thick air. "Sarah, can you hear us? Sarah." Each shout felt weaker than the last, absorbed by the hungry quiet of the woods. There was no echo, no reply, just the maddening, heavy silence. It was like screaming into a void. I hated it. I hated the way the trees loomed out of the fog, indistinct and menacing. I hated the way the trail kept twisting, never showing us more than a tiny piece of what lay ahead. "This is ridiculous," Emily muttered, her voice tight with frustration. She rubbed her arms as if trying to warm herself. "We can't see anything." "We have to keep going," Mike said, his voice flat. He was leading, his shape a darker blur just ahead of me. "What else are we supposed to do?" He was right. What else indeed? We couldn't just stand there waiting. Not for Sarah. And definitely not in that awful fog. We just kept putting one foot in front of the other, moving downhill, hoping each step would bring us closer to Sarah, or at least closer to the trailhead where we could get help. We had probably been walking for about 20 minutes, maybe more. It was hard to tell in the fog. Every minute felt like an hour. We were halfway down the giant ledge trail, somewhere around where the trail had started to get particularly rocky yesterday. I could almost feel the phantom ache in my calves from the climb. And then it happened. A scream tore through the fog. It was shrill, desperate, and utterly terrifying. It wasn't just a yell. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Sarah. There was no question. The sound cut through the heavy silence and the thick fog, seeming to come from somewhere above us, further up the trail, deeper into the woods we had just left. It was short, sharp, and then it was gone, leaving behind an even more shocking silence than before. We all froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. My blood ran cold instantly. Emily gasped, a little sound of pure terror in her throat. Mike, who had been a few steps ahead, spun around, his eyes wide and wild. They were already red-rimmed from earlier worry, but now they held a new, deeper panic. "Sarah," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. We stared at each other, our faces probably ghostly white in the dim light. The realization hit us all at once, like a physical blow. She wasn't gone from the mountain. She was still here, and she was in real, serious danger. Whatever had happened to her this morning, it was happening now again. I could feel the cold prickle all over my skin, almost like thousands of tiny needles. I rubbed my arms, not to warm them, but to try and get rid of the feeling. It was more than cold. It was dread. "She's up there," I said, my voice hoarse. It felt like I was speaking through a mouthful of sand. "We have to go back." There was no debate, no discussion. The choice was instinctive. Sarah was in trouble. That scream was all the direction we needed. We had to go to her, even if it meant heading back into unknown danger, back into that heavy fog. We turned around, scrambling, our movements choppy and uneven. We started back up the trail, pushing ourselves harder now, not caring about footing or careful steps. We just needed to get to her. "Sarah," Mike yelled, his voice cracking. "Sarah, where are you?" "Sarah," Emily joined in, tears starting to stream down her face, mixing with the dampness of the fog. I yelled her name too, over and over, my voice raw and desperate. But the dense fog swallowed our shouts, muffling them, making them sound weak and distant even to our own ears. It was like the mountain was actively trying to keep us from finding her, building a wall of silence and mist around us. The air grew colder, the chill more intense as we climbed. It felt like walking through a freezer. We pushed on, our lungs burning, our legs aching. Every step uphill felt like climbing a wall. The fog was so thick I could barely see Mike, who was still just ahead of me. Emily was a little behind me, her breathing ragged. I could hear her stumbling, almost falling a few times. "Emily, you okay?" I shouted over my shoulder, not slowing down, just calling out to her. "Yeah," she gasped, her voice tight with strain. "Just tired." We kept going, the image of Sarah's terrified face searing itself into my mind. The scream replayed in my head over and over, a horrible soundtrack to our frantic climb. I could feel the ground getting steeper again, the trail becoming more rooted and uneven. We were back in the thick of it, where the biggest trees grew, where the sunlight barely reached even on a clear day. Now, with the fog, it was practically night. Then, just as I heard Emily let out another ragged gasp, I heard a thud behind me. I slowed down, turning my head. Emily cried out, "Ah, my knee." I stopped completely, turning to look back. Emily was on the ground, one knee bent at a weird angle, her hand stretched out. She had tripped, for real this time, over one of those thick, gnarled roots that crisscrossed the trail. Her face was scrunched up in pain. Mike had heard her too, and he stopped, looking back at us. "You okay?" he asked, already starting to walk back towards her. I heard something," Emily mumbled, ignoring his question for a second. She sat up, her hand still pressed to the ground, rooting around in the damp leaves right next to the gnarled root she had tripped on. It was like she wasn't even feeling the pain in her knee anymore. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something in the leaves. Her fingers closed around something, and she pulled it free. In her palm, glinting dully in the weak light, was a tarnished silver locket. It was small, probably no bigger than my thumb, and it looked old, really old. One side was engraved with 2 letters, M.E. It wasn't Sarah's. I knew that instantly. None of us owned anything like that. It looked like something out of a period movie. Emily stared at it, her face pale. She brought it closer, turning it over in her hand, her thumb tracing the old letters. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. At that exact moment, a chilling, faint sound drifted through the swirling mist around us. It was a whisper, almost imperceptible, like dry leaves rustling, or maybe air moving. But it was more than that. It wasn't just wind. It felt closer, right next to my ear, and it seemed to carry a strange, low hum, a tiny, vibrating presence in the thick quiet of the fog. It made every single hair on my arm stand straight up. It wasn't a sound I recognized. It just shouldn't have been there. I stopped completely, turning to look back. Emily was on the ground, one knee bent at a weird angle, her hand stretched out. She had tripped, for real this time, over one of those thick, gnarled roots that crisscrossed the trail. Her face was scrunched up in pain. Mike had heard her too, and he stopped, looking back at us. "You okay?" he asked, already starting to walk back towards her. I heard something," Emily mumbled, ignoring his question for a second. She sat up, her hand still pressed to the ground, rooting around in the damp leaves right next to the gnarled root she had tripped on. It was like she wasn't even feeling the pain in her knee anymore. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something in the leaves. Her fingers closed around something, and she pulled it free. In her palm, glinting dully in the weak light, was a tarnished silver locket. It was small, probably no bigger than my thumb, and it looked old, really old. One side was engraved with 2 letters, M.E. It wasn't Sarah's. I knew that instantly. None of us owned anything like that. It looked like something out of a period movie. Emily stared at it, her face pale. She brought it closer, turning it over in her hand, her thumb tracing the old letters. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. At that exact moment, a chilling, faint sound drifted through the swirling mist around us. It was a whisper, almost imperceptible, like dry leaves rustling, or maybe air moving. But it was more than that. It wasn't just wind. It felt closer, right next to my ear, and it seemed to carry a strange, low hum, a tiny, vibrating presence in the thick quiet of the fog. It made every single hair on my arm stand straight up. It wasn't a sound I recognized. It just shouldn't have been there. My blood ran cold again, just like it had when Sarah screamed. That low hum seemed to vibrate right inside my skull. Emily, still on the ground, dropped the locket. It hit the damp leaves with a soft tap, making no sound. Mike, who had taken a step towards her, hesitated, his head twisting as if trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. His eyes were wide with a new kind of fear, different from the panic, deeper, more primal. It was the look of someone hearing something they shouldn't. Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I just nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The sound was still there, a soft, dry whisper that seemed to press in from all sides. It wasn't loud, not really, but it was asterisk everywhere. It made the air feel thick and heavy and wrong. My eyes darted around, trying to see something in the swirling fog, anything that could make that sound. But there was nothing, just the indistinct shapes of trees that seemed to rise out of the mist like silent guards. Mike finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "What was that? Was that the wind?" "No," I managed to rasp, my voice sounding rough. "No, it wasn't wind. I knew it wasn't. Wind makes noise, sure, but it doesn't hum. It doesn't crawl into your head like that. This was different. This felt like it was alive. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught in that unnatural silence and the strange, dry whisper that permeated everything. Emily, still on the ground, looked up at us, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and terror. She looked so small, so exposed. "My knee," she finally choked out, pulling herself up slowly, wincing. "I think I twisted it pretty bad." I took a step towards her, wanting to help, but the faint sound, that haunting whisper, kept me frozen. It was louder now, seeming to swirl around us, sometimes coming from my left, then my right, then directly behind me. It was disorienting, designed to mess with our heads. I could feel myself almost leaning into it, trying to catch a discernible word, but it was just a jumble of dry, shifting sounds, like someone rustling 1,000 dead leaves right next to my ear. Mike was beside Emily now, his hands reaching to help her up. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice low. Emily pushed herself up, biting back a cry as she put weight on her injured knee. She put a hand on Mike's shoulder, leaning heavily on him. "It hurts," she said, her voice tight. "But I can walk." She wouldn't be able to walk fast, though. I knew that instantly. Not with that kind of injury, and not on this terrain with the steep, uneven trail and the thick fog. The realization hit me hard. We couldn't outrun whatever this was. We couldn't outrun anything, not like this. Panic started to really set in now, a cold, sharp claw in my chest. We were stuck. The whispering intensified, the sound closing in, pressing down on us. It felt like the air itself was vibrating with it. I could still hear Emily breathing heavily and Mike's ragged breaths. The trail was a blur, the trees just shadows. It was a suffocating, terrifying world. Then, through the dense, white curtain of the fog, just ahead of us, I saw it. A shape. It was dark, a patch of something intensely black against the muted gray of the mist. It was amorphous, not really a distinct form, more like a shifting blob of deepest shadow. And it moved. It darted across our path, fast, impossibly fast, in a silent, gliding rush that defied anything natural. 1 second it was there, a dark smear, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the fog on the other side of the trail. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't even realize I had been holding it. I just stared at the empty space where it had been, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just seen. It was too fast to identify, too shapeless, too utterly wrong. Mike, who had been a few paces ahead of me, and Emily, let out a choked cry. I saw him stumble, his legs tangling under him. He went down hard, landing on his side with a grunt. Emily cried out in alarm. "Mike," I yelled, rushing forward without thinking. He was on the ground, tangled in his own legs, his face contorted in pain. He must have tripped over a loose rock, adding to his earlier injuries. "My ankle." He groaned, trying to push himself up, but he immediately slumped back down, his hand clutching his leg. He bit his lip, a muffled curse escaping. I think I twisted it. My heart sank. Emily was limping, barely able to keep her balance. Now Mike couldn't walk. We were in serious trouble. We were dead in the water, stranded, with whatever that thing was lurking in the fog around us. The silent whisper was still there, the low hum intensifying, almost a purr now, a soft, predatory sound. "We have to go," I said, my voice urgent. "We can't stay here, not like this." I reached down and grabbed Mike's arm, pulling him up. Emily was on his other side, trying to help him stand, but he cried out again, unable to put any weight on his injured ankle. He swore, a frustrated, pained sound. "I can't," he muttered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I can't put any weight on it." We hauled him up, one on each side, practically dragging him. His injured foot dangled uselessly. Our movements were rushed and panicked, clumsy in the thick fog. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, trying to smother us. The cold had intensified, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the presence of something truly malevolent, something unseen, but definitely felt. My mind raced, trying to think, trying to find a way out of this impossible situation. We couldn't run. We couldn't hide in plain sight. What else was there? A faint memory surfaced then, something about an old building, a shelter of some kind. "The cabin," I blurted out, the words tumbling out of my mouth. The old ranger's cabin, about a mile back, off a side trail. We passed it on the way up yesterday. Mike and Emily looked at me, their eyes wide and desperate. I remembered it well enough, a small, run-down structure, barely visible through the trees when we had seen it yesterday. It was off a disused side trail, barely a path at all, just a narrow cut through the thick brush. It hadn't looked like much, even from a distance, more like a shack than a cabin, but it was better than nothing. It was better than being out here in the open, vulnerable. "A cabin?" Emily asked, her voice a little breathless. "Are you sure?" "It's our only shot," I said, pushing down the rising tide of fear. What else could we do? Stay there and wait for that thing, whatever it was, to come at us again? No, that wasn't an option. If we can just get there, we can barricade ourselves in, get some kind of shelter. It was a crazy idea, a gamble, but we had to take it. We started moving slowly, painfully. Mike was gritting his teeth, leaning heavily on both of us. Each step was a struggle, his injured ankle clearly causing him intense pain. Emily, with her own twisted knee, was limping, but she pushed through it, her face set in a grim line. I was just trying to keep us moving forward, trying to navigate blindly through the fog. The whispering around us grew louder. It was no longer just a dry rustle or a low hum. Now it was almost discernible, a flurry of strange, indistinct words, barely audible at the edge of hearing, just on the periphery of understanding. It sounded like dozens of voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping, twisting into a garble of meaninglessness, yet still somehow communicating something chilling and deeply personal. It seemed to come from all directions, weaving through the thick fog like a hungry, unseen presence. It was disorienting, unsettling, turning the world into a spinning vortex of sound. The tension stretched to an unbearable level, a tight, vibrating wire. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me. I could feel unseen eyes on us, a profound chill seeping deep into my bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with being hunted. It felt like walking through solid ice, knowing that something was following close, breathing down our necks, waiting for us to make a mistake. We were meat, pure and simple prey. Each tortured step brought us closer to whatever awaited us, or closer to the flimsy hope of that cabin. My skin crawled, feeling exposed and vulnerable. We kept moving, our breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to ignore the constant, maddening whisper that pressed in around us. Each tortured step brought us closer to whatever awaited us, or closer to the flimsy hope of that cabin. My skin crawled, feeling exposed and vulnerable. We kept moving, our breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to ignore the constant, maddening whisper that pressed in around us. The whispers finally started to fade as we stumbled down the trail, a little at a time. The low hum softened, then disappeared completely, leaving behind a silence that felt even more deafening than before. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the forest we had just left. This was a dead silence, dry and dusty, like the air inside an old, forgotten tomb. It felt like we had walked out of one kind of evil and into another. Then, through a break in the trees, I saw it. The cabin. It was barely a cabin, really, more of a ramshackle shed, leaning precariously to one side. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows grimy with dirt and grime. It was nestled a little off the main trail, hidden by a cluster of thick, overgrown brush. The roof sagged in the middle, and what looked like the front door hung crooked on one hinge. It looked abandoned, like it had been left to rot for decades. Even the air around it felt still and stagnant, completely unlike the living forest we had just been in. "There it is," I gasped, the words catching in my throat. My voice sounded thin, almost breaking the profound silence. Mike and Emily looked at it, their faces pale in the dim light. They didn't say anything, but I could see the same desperate hope in their eyes that I felt. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was better than nothing. We hobbled towards it, our feet dragging through the dry leaves and broken twigs. The closer we got, the more rundown it looked. The wind didn't even seem to touch this place. It was like a dead zone, untouched by anything living. The porch, if you could even call it that, was just a few rotting planks. I pushed the door open, wincing at the harsh, grating sound of wood scraping against wood. It felt unnaturally heavy, almost like it was resisting. The inside was even worse than the outside. It was a single, small room, choked with dust and mildew. The air was thick, stale. I could almost taste the decay. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains from the low ceiling, and the small, grimy window panes let in barely any light, just a faint, milky glow that made shadows dance in the corners. It smelled like damp earth and something else, something I couldn't quite place, but it was sharp and unpleasant, like something very old and very dead. I didn't even think. My first instinct was to get that door secured. It was hanging on for dear life, barely attached to the frame. I looked around, desperate for anything. My eyes landed on a thick, dark log lying just outside the entrance, half buried in the leaves. It looked sturdy, heavy enough to block the door. "Help me with this," I said, my voice rough. I stepped back out and started dragging the log. It was heavier than I thought, but I pulled hard. Mike, wincing with every step he took on his injured ankle, limped over to help me. Emily stood in the doorway, staring into the gloom of the cabin, her face pale. We hauled the log over to the door, and with a lot of grunting and straining, wedged it against the frame, pushing the door shut as much as it would go. The log didn't fit perfectly, but it was enough to keep it from just swinging open. It was a flimsy barrier, just like the tents back at camp, but it was all we had. "Okay," I said, leaning against the log, trying to catch my breath. The air still felt weird. "Check for anything at all." Emily, despite her knee, started moving, her eyes scanning the dusty shelves and the few broken pieces of furniture scattered around the room. Mike, still leaning heavily on the doorframe, looked around, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. "It's just dust," Emily said, her voice hollow, as she waved her hand through the air. A cloud of fine, gray particles instantly exploded around her. She coughed, wrapping her arm around her mouth. I pushed away from the door, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a rusted, pot-bellied stove in one corner and a narrow, uneven wooden table in the center. An overturned chair lay next to the table. And there, on a narrow shelf nailed to the wall, I saw something. It was small, glinting faintly in the gloom. "Hold on," I said, stepping past Emily. I reached up and carefully took it down. It was a mirror, tarnished and caked with dust. The glass was cracked in one corner, and the silver backing was peeling away in strips, showing dull, black patches underneath. It had clearly been through a lot. It felt cold and heavy in my hand, strangely cold, like it had been in a refrigerator. This thing was old, really old. "Anything else?" I asked, turning to Emily. She shook her head. My eyes landed on something else, half hidden under the table, almost completely obscured by shadows and dust. It was dark, a shape, something solid. I bent down, wincing as my stiff muscles protested, and reached for it. It was a book, an old, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and peeling, its pages yellowed and brittle. It felt dry and light in my hand, as if it had been left there for a very, very long time. "Look at this," I said, holding it out to Mike. He was closer than Emily, so he grabbed it. Mike took the journal, his brow furrowed. He moved over to the small, cracked window, trying to catch a little more of the weak light. He winced as he shifted his weight, his injured ankle clearly still bothering him. He opened the book carefully, the dried pages crinkling under his fingers. A puff of fine, brown dust rose into the air. He started to read, his lips moving silently, his eyes scanning the cramped, faded handwriting. The room was utterly silent except for the rustle of the pages. Emily and I just stood there, watching him, waiting. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The cold that had nothing to do with temperature was still there, the one that meant something terrible was lurking outside. I could see the lines of worry deepening on Mike's face as he read. His eyes were wide, and he kept shaking his head, a little, almost imperceptible movement. After a few minutes, he finally looked up, his face pale and drawn. This is crazy," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. "It's a journal. Someone lived here or stayed here a long time ago." "What does it say?" Emily asked, stepping closer. Her voice was just an anxious murmur. "It talks about a shadow form," Mike said, his voice barely audible. He looked down at the journal again, his thumb tracing the faded words. "A thing that feeds on fear. It says it abducts people, makes them disappear. It sounds just like what happened to Sarah this morning." My blood ran cold. A shadow form, fed on fear. It was all clicking into place, a horrifying picture. Mike continued, his voice low and tight. "There's an entry here dated decades ago. It talks about a young woman disappearing, Mary Elizabeth. Her initials match the locket, ME, the one Emily found." Emily gasped, her hand going to her mouth. She backed up a step, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and understanding. The locket. It wasn't just some random thing. It was real. Connected. Mike flipped through a few more pages, the old paper making a dry, whispering sound. "The family, Mary Elizabeth's family, they built this cabin," he explained, his voice strained. "They thought it would be a refuge after something else happened. They believed in all these old superstitions, that certain places or certain beliefs could ward off evils. Superstitions, that's what it was. An old ghost story, except it wasn't a story. It was real, and it was outside, waiting for us." Just then, a loud asterisk thud echoed from the outside wall, right next to where I was standing. The sound was thick, heavy, like a large, solid weight hitting the wood. It made the entire cabin shake, a violent shudder that sent a cascade of dust and cobwebs falling from the ceiling. We all jumped, our breath catching in our throats. Emily let out a little shriek. "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the wall, my mind racing. It wasn't just a physical attack. It was more than that. This thing, this shadow form, it wanted us to be scared. It was feeding on our fear, just like the journal said. It wasn't just trying to break in and physically harm us. It was trying to drain us dry, drain our hope, our sanity. It was playing with us, a cat with a mouse. It felt like it was testing our resolve, testing our defenses, checking to see how close it was to breaking us. The journal. This stupid, old, dusty book. It was the key. It was the only thing that could tell us what this thing was and how to stop it. Mike was still holding it, his hands shaking slightly. He hadn't stopped reading, not even when the thud made the cabin jump. He was still scanning the frantic handwriting, his eyes glued to the pages. The journal. This stupid, old, dusty book. It was the key. It was the only thing that could tell us what this thing was and how to stop it. Mike was still holding it, his hands shaking slightly. He hadn't stopped reading, not even when the thud made the cabin jump. He was still scanning the frantic handwriting, his eyes glued to the pages. The silence in the cabin was so thick it pretty much hummed. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The thud outside was just the start. It came again, a bit harder this time, like a punch to the side of the cabin. Then another, a low scraping sound, like claws raking wood. It was relentless, trying to get in, testing our flimsy defenses. The cabin shuddered with each hit, dust and cobwebs raining down. It was a miserable place, and now it felt like a cage ready to collapse. The wood groaned under the assault, protesting every hit, every scrape. Emily and I just stood there, watching Mike, our faces pale, holding our breath with every jarring blow. We had nothing, just a thin wooden barrier. Mike, meanwhile, had truly zoned out. He was lost in the journal, his brow furrowed, his eyes darting across the worn pages. He didn't even flinch when the cabin shook anymore. He was mumbling to himself, just under his breath, barely audible. I could tell he was getting to the good stuff, the important parts. The tension in the room was so thick you could spoon it. Every creak of the old wood, every scrape outside, made my skin crawl. It says it doesn't like happiness, Mike finally blurted out, looking up from the book, his eyes wide. His voice sounded strained, like he was trying to make sense of something completely crazy. Positive energy, hope, unity, that's what it hates. He looked back down, flipping pages, then his eyes snapped back up to us. It says it can break down, temporarily dissolve, if there's enough concentrated good feeling. It's like a shield, a barrier. A shield? Emily asked, her voice quiet. She took a step closer, still looking at the battered walls. Like we just think happy thoughts. Mike shook his head, flipping another page. No, not just thoughts. It's about collective will. And this part, he tapped a section on the old paper. This is from Elias, Mary Elizabeth's brother. He wrote this part. He believed that the combined will of loving individuals could create a protective barrier. He thought this thing was just a big shadow, really. Not truly solid, not always. He had a theory that if enough people focused, it could make it disappear. He looked back at the book, his eyes still searching. Then he looked up again, his face a little more animated. He also mentions a clearing deeper in the woods, the Sunstone Clearing. It has these naturally charged granite formations. He says they amplify natural energy. Good energy, he means. Bad energy too, I guess. But he thought they could make positive energy even stronger. So, what, we go there? I asked, completely baffled. This was reaching a whole new level of crazy. We could barely walk, let alone fight some shadow thing with good vibes. We can't even get out of here right now. We can't just hide, James, Mike said, his voice firm. He closed the journal then, the dry pages making a soft rustle. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of determination in his eyes. He says that if you hide, it just waits and grows stronger. It needs to be confronted. Confronted with positive energy, Emily asked, a little disbelieving. She looked at our injuries, then at the flimsy door. That's what the journal says, Mike insisted. But there's more. Something else that Elias mentions, vague stuff about its anchors. Things that tie it here, things it takes from people. Something sparked in Emily's eyes. She put her hand on her chin, thinking hard. My grandma used to tell us these stories, she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the din outside. About bad spirits and how to banish them. She said you had to burn something they possessed, something they had taken. She looked at me then. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. The wooden bird, James, the one you found, Sarah's. If it belonged to her, if it's connected to her, we have to burn it. My stomach clenched. Sarah's bird. It was all we had left of her. But I knew Emily was right. If this journal was true, if the entity was a shadow form feeding on fear, then anything it took, anything it possessed, was a link. And if we broke that link... Okay, I said, the word feeling rough in my throat. I hated the idea, absolutely hated it, but it made a twisted kind of sense. Okay, we burn it, but how do we get to this clearing? And how do we fight a shadow with good feelings? Mike looked at me, his eyes showing a spark of something I hadn't seen in a while, hope. We need a plan, a distraction. Someone has to lure it away so the others can get to the clearing. And someone needs to be there to make it work, to focus the energy. We looked at each other then, the three of us. My leg was still bad, Emily's knee was hurting, and Mike's ankle was screaming. Moving for any of us was hard, but I knew deep down what had to be done. I was the one who found the bird. I was the one who found the locket. This felt like my messed up responsibility. I'll distract it, I said, before I could really think about it. The words just came out. You go to the clearing. You focus the energy. You burn the bird and the locket. We need both, right, to break its connection. Mike nodded, grabbing the locket from the floor where Emily had dropped it earlier. His hand closed around it. Yes, it makes sense. The locket was Mary Elizabeth's. The bird is Sarah's. It's how it keeps them. How do we get out? Emily asked, her voice urgent. The pounding on the front of the cabin had intensified. It sounded like the thing was getting frustrated. It sounded angry. There's a back window, I said, remembering the quick scan I did of the dusty room. It was small, boarded up, but it was there. It looked loose. We can probably push through it. The plan was insane, of course. It was desperate, but we were desperate. We had nothing else. We had to try. We moved fast as our injured bodies would let us. Mike hobbled over to the back wall, his face screwed up in pain. and started pushing on the rickety boards over the window. Emily, despite her knee, was right there with him, ready to pull on whatever needed to be pulled. The creature was still focused on the front of the cabin, the pounding shaking the whole structure. It sounded like it was getting louder, closer. It was definitely mad. I was already grabbing the bird from my jacket pocket, my fingers tightening around the smooth wood. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I would draw its attention away. Maybe making a lot of noise. Maybe just running. Whatever it was, it had to be convincing. It had to be enough to make it leave Mike and Emily alone. With a loud crack, one of the boards gave way. Mike grunted, pulling it free. Emily pulled another one. Slowly, a narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for us to squeeze through. A gust of cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the familiar scent of wet earth and pine. That was good, I thought. At least the air was fresh. "Go," I whispered, my voice rough, pushing them towards the opening. "Go now. Find the clearing. I'll follow. Just give me a little bit of time." Mike didn't hesitate. He nodded, gave me a quick, intense look, and then squeezed through the opening, half crawling, half hobbling. Emily followed right after him, her limp more pronounced as she pushed through the narrow space. I heard the scuff of their boots on the leaves outside, then the rustle of brush as they tried to move quietly away from the cabin. I stood there for a second, feeling the cold air on my face, listening to the creature pound on the front of the cabin. It sounded so close, so furious. This was it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden tremor in my hands. The bird felt like a solid weight in my palm. I pulled all the rest of the boards off the opening, making it look like the place where they had gone. I stepped back from the window, and with a sudden, loud yell, I kicked the table in the middle of the room. It went over with a crash, sending old pots and pans clattering to the floor. The pounding on the front of the cabin stopped. Instantly, a profound, unnatural silence fell over the place, broken only by the sharp, ringing sound as a metal pot settled. My breath hitched. It had heard me. It was listening. I could feel its attention shift, its unseen presence turning. The air in the cabin grew colder, heavier, even more oppressive. I knew it was coming for me. This was my chance. Now or never. I moved fast, launching myself back towards the window, slipping through the opening. The cold air rushed in after me, and I could feel a sudden, intense chill right at my back. It was angry. It was definitely after me. I pushed myself to run, limping furiously through the dense underbrush, trying to make as much noise as possible. I crashed through bushes, snapped twigs and branches, just making a straight line towards where I thought the clearing would be, hoping I was getting it right. I glanced back, seeing nothing but swirling fog, but I could asterisk feel it. It was right behind me, a deep, bone-chilling cold that tightened my skin. As I ran, I could hear it. Not the familiar whisper, but a new sound, a sound of pure rage. It was a low, tearing sound, like heavy cloth ripping, combined with a weird kind of shriek, high-pitched and full of something like agony. It was getting closer, moving impossibly fast, just a blur of black against the gray as the fog thinned a bit, and I knew I was drawing it out. It was focused on me completely. It was ignoring the others, I finally burst through a thick curtain of trees and into a clearing. It was a wide, open space with towering granite formations rising from the ground, smooth and dark. This had to be it, the Sunstone clearing. I spun around, ready, clutching the wooden bird. Just then, I heard it. A faint asterisk crack from behind me, louder than I expected. I didn't need to look. It was the sound of something brittle shattering. The locket. Mike must have crushed it, or broken it, something to snap its connection. Immediately, the shriek of the entity intensified, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and fury. It vibrated everything. It was no longer chasing me. It was thrashing, a black, formless mass twisting in the air, right on the edge of the clearing. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a different sound. A low crackling, getting louder, faster. The bird. Emily was burning it. The flames must have caught. The entity let out another shriek, even louder than the last one, as the wooden bird disintegrated in the flames. I could feel it, a raw, painful force ripped from the thing itself. The shadow form writhed, twisting into impossibly tight knots, its blackness rippling like oil on water. And then it happened. From the very center of the clearing, from the ancient granite formations, a wave of pure, concentrated energy erupted. It was a blinding white light, warm and comforting, completely unlike any light I had ever felt, and it surged outward, engulfing the screeching entity. The shadow form bucked, convulsed, then began to dissipate, dissolving into wisps of smoke that were instantly gone as the wave of energy washed over them. It shrunk, getting smaller and smaller, its furious shriek fading into nothing more than a faint hiss. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it simply vanished into the air. 1 second it was there, a mass of pure malice, and the next it was gone, completely. The blinding light from the clearing faded. The silence that followed was profound, deeper than any silence I had ever known. But this time, it was a peaceful quiet. The crushing weight that had been in the air, the cold, the fear, it was all gone. Just nothing. I stood there, panting, looking at the empty space where the entity had been. The clearing was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, and the air felt clean, fresh, completely pure. A sound then, a faint whimpering, barely audible. I focused on it. It came from right beside one of the granite formations. I turned, my eyes wide. Sarah. She was there, lying on the ground, curled up, her clothes dirty and torn, her face pale. She was weak, disoriented, but she was alive. She actually materialized out of nowhere, almost like she had just been released from some kind of invisible prison. "Sarah," I yelled, rushing towards her, stumbling over my bad leg. Emily and Mike were right behind me, pushing through the brush, their faces streaked with dirt and tears, their eyes wide. They saw her too. Emily let out a sob, dropping to her knees beside Sarah. Mike just stared, his mouth hanging open. Sarah was there. She was really there. We helped her up, careful with her. She was dazed, confused, barely able to stand. But she was free. The immediate danger was gone. We were shaken, of course, utterly exhausted, scraped and bruised and injured. But we were safe. We walked out of the woods, slowly, painfully, supporting Sarah between us. The fog had thinned, and a pale, Weak sunlight filtered through the trees, a sight I thought I might never see again. The forest felt different now. No longer a place of terror, but a place we had survived. We were forever changed by what we had been through, bound together by the terrifying encounter and by the strange, unexpected power of hope that had saved us all. We walked away from that place, the four of us, knowing we would never be the same.